Hey guys, it's Gary. I'm back again for a quite short one today. Um, Instead of doing nothing, which I've been doing a lot of lately, I decided maybe I would do something I kind of pulled off the shelf and have been listening to a bit. But I'm no expert, so this is not somebody that I've got a lot of history on or know a great deal about. Actually, almost everything I learned about this composer, David Bedford, is pretty much what I learned from Wikipedia and just a few things that I knew uh, just from picking up over the years, but small things. So I only have actually two solo albums by David Bedford, the British composer, born 1937, sadly died October 2011, which is something that I just learned of probably within the last year. He was 74. Now, most people, if they've come across David Bedford's name at all, it'd certainly be Prague fans, no doubt about it. And this is probably where they would have heard him from. He is the guy that orchestrated Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells album, which I love. A lot of people really don't like this, but I love it. It leaves out the rockier stuff because it's orchestral tubular bells, so it's the guitar stuff isn't there really, and but a lot of the rough edges, there's some aspects of the original tubular bells that I'm not crazy about. It's a pretty brilliant piece, but there's some moments on there that are obviously smoothed over and not there because this is a totally new, complete orchestral version. That this was done shortly after the original took off, a couple of years. I remember when this came out. It took me a long time to finally pick it up. People have mixed emotions about it, but I love it. And when it came time to orchestrate it, Mike Oldfield is not a classically, traditionally trained musician, so they got David Bedford to do it. And music's probably loud, but I don't even know if I have my volume control here. Hold on. I'm playing David Bedford music, and it's orchestral, some of the stuff I'm playing. And just like classical music and orchestral music, it gets insanely loud at times, and then the rest of the times you can't hear it. And that's my fault for even attempting to try to play some of it in the background. But he orchestrated Tubular Bells, did a fantastic job for it. It's really nice to hear all the orchestral colors in this, especially if you're familiar with the piece. A lot of fans don't like it, but I think a lot of fans that bought it and listened to it are more rock fans than anything else, and really, in a lot of ways, don't really appreciate orchestral music. I don't know if Mike Oldfield chose Dave Bedford to do it. I'm guessing they did because they knew each other. Dave Bedford was a British, traditionally classically trained musician, so he right from the get-go. And just stealing some of the information on here on Wikipedia, he was a composer in residence at Queen's College London from 1968 to 1980. He was appointed composer in association with the English Sinfonia in 2001. He was a teacher throughout his entire career, which was a bit funny because you see people put out albums on a regular basis and assume by major record labels, you assume that they're making a living in music, and apparently he taught music pretty much his entire career, maybe up until the last few years that he was alive. And I've seen various places on the internet, a lot of people complimenting him that were students of his and people that had actually played orchestral pieces that he composed. He was known for composing, in one of his periods, I guess pieces that were not intensely difficult to play, that were easier to play for younger people in orchestras. Not that you would know by listening to the music. And he was apparently very much well loved by his students. It was only recently that I learned that he had been a teacher all those years because I see Dave Bedford albums since the 70s. Where did I first hear of him was back in the days, in the late 70s, when I was first discovering the import section, and I first got into artists like Klaus Schulze, The Tangerine Dream, and all these things that pretty much weren't available domestically. I used to go to the import section and buy nothing but imports for a period of quite a few years in the vinyl age. I would say from like 77 till I really started getting into jazz. I stopped looking at domestic stuff at all, and because to me I was getting into electronic music and things away from the rock world, but not quite into jazz yet. And none of the artists were really having many of their albums released in the U.S. And I ended up going to the import section and picking them up. And as a result of that, the one Sam Goody store that I used to go to all the time, I'd come up with it when I got my first job. I'd come up with a stack of albums, and every single one of them had the sticker from the Gem Imports, which was actually a company here in New Jersey that imported all the records. Pretty much, I think they were the only import company in the business at that time. And they all had these big round red or orange stickers on the albums imported by Gem Records. And one day they had apparently given a handful of their annual import catalog to the store. And because I was in there so much, and like literally every album I bought was a Gem import record, they gave me one of the catalogs for free. And I got to tell you, that was a prized possession for over 10 years, even though obviously it was outdated and not getting updated at that point. It was a fantastic, large magazine, thick book of albums. And at that time, you didn't have the internet to check these things out. And one of the things that caught my attention was pictures of the album covers, a little description of the album, who played on it. I kept that thing for many years until it was just shreds and Gem Records wasn't even around anymore. And one of the things that really caught my attention was they had a bunch of David Bedford albums in there. I'm going to try to remember to link one of them. There's a whole bunch of his music on YouTube. But one of his early albums from the early 70s, what's the name of it? It's called Nurse's Song with Elephants. That's the album title. It's got a beautiful cover. And the first thing that I noticed is I was struck by the album cover. And he had some very, very cool album covers. Not like Yes had Roger Dean and he had a certain style. It didn't look like Roger Dean's style, but he had some very, very, very cool artwork on his album covers, which drew me to them. And at that time, I was just, having got my first job, there were albums I had wanted for years. And I really meant, but I never did pick up any of David Bedford's albums. And to be honest, at that time, they looked a little bit over my head. And now that I've heard them, some of these I'm hearing on YouTube for the first time. They're a bit avant-garde, and I certainly wouldn't have appreciated them. I kind of knew that there was a lot of orchestral stuff going on the albums, too. I don't think I was ready for it at that time. And then, so I had that catalog, and I used to see these cool album covers, which I'm going to try to remember to link the Nurse's Song with Elephants. You could hear the album. It's a little on the avant-garde side, and you could see the beautiful cover art. And if you're interested, go. There's other things when you bring him up that we'll link to some other compositions by him and albums. But the next time, I kind of forgot about Dave Bedford because then I started getting into jazz and stuff like that. Then, of course, I noticed Orchestral Tubular Bells, which was an album that I always wanted. I never picked up on vinyl. A CD version is the first version I picked up. And it's like, oh, yeah, it's by that guy David Bedford. Dave Bedford played, if you know who Kevin Ayers is, who died only a year or two ago, a British singer, songwriter, guitarist, sometime bass player, played in the original Soft Machine, but started his own solo band afterwards, known for his very, very deep voice. Even sang on a couple tracks on Mike Oldfield's album. I think it was called Islands. Well, he started his own band, and he employed Lowell Coxhill, the jazz saxophone player, if you know who he is, Mike Oldfield, which was pretty much the last band that Mike Oldfield played in. Mike Oldfield was the bass player in Kevin Ayers' band. And Dave Bedford was hired to do some orchestrations, I believe, for Kevin Ayers' album. And in addition to the orchestrations, he played keyboards on it. And he, for a while, became a member of Kevin Ayers' band, which is how he met Lowell Coxhill, who he formed a working relationship with, the saxophone player. And they worked as a duo for some time, just keyboards and saxophone. and also Mike Oldfield. And I'm sure Mike Oldfield must have been impressed by his musical knowledge and ability, so that when it came time to orchestrate the Tubular Bells album, I'm assuming it was him, I'm guessing, who called David Bedford to do it. Mike Oldfield's second album was called Hergest Ridge, and Dave Bedford was also approached and wrote an orchestral version of Hergest Ridge, which was performed. I know it was performed and recorded. I think basically there was a live performance that was recorded of the Hergest Ridge album, which was Mike Oldfield's second album. And oddly enough, to this day, they have not released that orchestral version, which is weird because it's in the can, it's recorded, it's done, and people for years have been wondering how come it's not been released all these years. And that again was done early 70s. It's been a long time. So I don't have a lot of Dave Bedford, which is why this is not going to be an hour-long thing. But I started really appreciating his writing, how he orchestrated the Tubular Bells. The better you know the original Tubular Bells album, the more I think you appreciate the orchestral version. And just the thought of some guy sitting down there and writing, okay, I'm going to have the French horns play this, I'm going to have some strings play that. It's work. It's a pain in the butt. And just the fact that he could do that, which he did everywhere for everybody. He did for other people. He did for his own music. He wrote a lot of orchestral music through the years, through his whole career, really. I came across, and this is I'm fairly sure the only album where he did this, an album, a late period album by him, toward the end of his career. 93. He lived another 8 years. But he had a long career. And toward the end of it, I discovered this album, and I just had to have it. And there's something, this is called Great Equatorial. And when I saw that it was a Dave Bedford album that was entirely performed on synthesizers by Dave Bedford, and I'm not aware of another single album where he did that. He mostly wrote large-scale works for orchestra. I had to have it, regardless of what kind of music it was. This was from 1993, and it was a commission by the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, England, to compose music to celebrate the renovation of the room containing the Great Equatorial Telescope and its reopening to the public. So it was essentially an installation piece. Music might be too loud, but, let me go on to the next. I'm just going to go on to the next track and hope it's a little quieter. So it was the reopening of this, I guess, massive equatorial telescope in England, and he was commissioned to write this music that was essentially be considered an installation. The idea was the music would be played continuously through the day as the public wandered around. His own notes say any traditional ideas of a beginning, middle, or end, or conventional development would therefore be pointless, since people would be arriving and leaving all the time. The obvious solution would have been to write a New Age ambient piece, so it wouldn't matter at what point listeners arrived and left. I've always tried to avoid obvious solutions throughout my composing career and devised a system of mini development for the piece, whereby whatever period of time was spent in the room by the visitor, he or she would be certain to hear at least one theme and its variation. In extending the piece, which was only originally 10 minutes long, to CD length, I've taken the opportunity to extend, vary, and develop the musical material at much greater length and in a more leisurely fashion than in the 10-minute version. And so he took all these themes, which I guess the original 10-minute version was also recorded just on synthesizers, and he expanded on it. And I forget how long the album is. The time in here. There's six actual parts. It's an hour. There's actually 6 parts, and each part is about 10 minutes long. So it's a full hour. The only shortcoming with it, it's not an ambient album, but it's not. It's close to an ambient album, but I think there's maybe a little bit too much going on for it to be considered an ambient album. You can certainly relax and mellow out to it. The only slight thing is this was the early 90s. He's working with probably late 80s synthesizers. He was mentioning a Korg M1, which is a synthesizer. I actually have a whole demonstration disc of music just being created on it. And that synthesizer came out about 92. But it very much had an early digital. It still sounded a lot like the 80s synthesizers, which were a little colder and digital sounding. So it doesn't have the greatest sound. And he's not a synthesizer whiz. I mean, he's not an Edgar Froessa that's sitting there working with synthesizers all the time and recording electronic music albums. So Dave Bedford isn't probably, going to go out and necessarily get the updated, the most updated equipment, even though at this time there probably was the most updated equipment. To me, it's much easier to listen to than, say, Tangerine Dream's early 80s albums, things like White Eagle and stuff like that, where the synthesizers really ruined the music for me. Because they sound so empty and hollow. So he used a Korg. You may or may not be familiar with that. The Proteus, which actually I have one of. Very, very, a little thin sounding synthesizer samples at times. And he used an early version of music software, Cubase, which was before Pro Tools came around. And he recorded it, and it sounds pretty good. There's not a lot of variation from track to track. But it's an album I love, and I'm glad I got it. I don't know, did I mention it's on the Voice Print label? It's just called The Great Equatorial. I highly recommend it. I believe, I should have checked, I believe it's, I don't want to necessarily say it's in print. I think it is. Voice Print is funny here in America because sometimes you can't get the records even though they're in print, and all of a sudden, if you look online, all of a sudden there'll be copies available again. They may not be at a really reasonable price, to be honest with you. So because I don't think Voice Print has a great distribution here in the U.S. Things come and go in terms of the availability and the prices when they are available. But it's I think for synth fans and people like Karn, it certainly would be worth looking out for, because it's literally the only album like this he did. I don't even know if there's another solo album by Dave Bedford of him just playing keyboards or whatever. To my knowledge, everything he did was kind of orchestral. And I switched discs. The first disc I played was the one I'm going to show you now, and how much you can hear it, I don't know. And now I'm playing the Great Equatorial disc in the background, which is the one I'm just talking about, the keyboard one. The only other album I have by him, and in time I will buy more. His work is very quirky, though. I don't think he's somebody that you would just, if you wanted to sample a work of his, it would be really hard, apart from the next one I'm going to mention, because his work is very quirky and it might turn you off into buying more of it. If you sample the wrong thing. Here's another album which I love. This is an orchestral album, which I highly recommend. It's probably the best place to start with his music, because I was just playing it in the background. There's no of his more oddball choices on that. It's purely orchestral music, and beautiful, great compositions, all by Dave Bedford. The album is called, it's weird because sometimes if you look for it, it won't come up under Dave Bedford, sometimes it does. It's the Royal Northern College of Music Wind Orchestra. Sometimes it comes up under that name, the Royal North College of Music Wind Orchestra, conducted by Clark Rundell, Rundell, and his name is the one that often comes up, and you're probably not going to be able to read that. Let's switch on. I'm trying to get the focus. Excuse me while I try to focus this, but it doesn't seem to be. Clark Rundell, anyway, and I think that's one of the ways that the CD came up at all. This is, I want to say, also from the late 90s. At least it was released in the late 90s, because one of the pieces on here were written in 96. And this album is fantastic. I heard there is one of the pieces on it, and there's there's 5 compositions on here. They're all written for primarily a wind orchestra, so there's a lot of horns, but it's very orchestral in texture. It's not big arranged horns like you might think of a big band jazz thing. It's very orchestral sounding, but there's a little more focus on the wind section versus the string section. And it's a great way to discover his music. I heard one track, and I'm going to try to find it and link it as well, on YouTube, called Sun Paints Rainbows on the Vast Waves. And that was the track. It's a 14-minute track that sold me on the album. Beautiful piece. And let me see, one of the pieces was written in 1990, another one 1982, 1996, and 2 more written in 1985. So they're all pieces written in the mid to late 80s to 82 to 96. And there's a lot of notes about the music in here in the CD, which is good. It gives you the background. It's wonderfully recorded. I don't have a recording date on here, but if the last piece was written, it's almost an hour long. If the last piece was written in 96, it had to have obviously been recorded sometime after that, and probably one of the later things of his own original music, at least. I highly recommend this. And I think the primary reason for me doing this video now is I only got this a couple months ago, maybe. I had first heard that piece, Sun Paints Rainbows on the Vast Waves, maybe a year ago here on YouTube. And I'm like, I got to get that album. And when I looked at the album, it's been out of print. The album is out of print. Somewhere here on YouTube, Dave Bedford, if you just look up David Bedford, you will see a webpage that is his webpage, apparently, or his homepage, whatever you call it. And his daughter apparently goes there and posts things and reads comments that people leave on occasion. So I don't know if it's one that he may have started before he passed away in 2011, so it's entirely possible, or whether it was started by his daughter or not. But that's where I've seen comments from folks saying how they had played some of his pieces that he wrote, and it was a pleasure to play them, and blah, blah, blah. But the reason I'm showing this now is when I first heard the piece over a year ago from this album, I was floored, and I went and I looked, and there were no copies available. Even used copies were really expensive. I kept my eye on it over the next year, and finally there was one copy that came available from a seller. It was $20-something, $4 for shipping, and I'm like, oh man, I don't know. There was only one. That was the only new copy available. And I hesitated, and I didn't think anybody, honestly, Dave Bedford is not that well known. I kind of thought, let me think about this for a day or two. Somebody grabbed the copy. And that was probably about 6 months after I started attempting to get the album. And then there was nothing but used copies available for kind of expensive prices. So only, I want to say a month or 6 weeks ago, I checked back on Amazon, and something happened. And this is the one time when it paid off for me, Wayne. Something happened, because this is most definitely out of print. And somehow, a bunch of copies, and I'm looking for my booklet here to try to find out. It's on the Doyen, D-O-Y-E-N music label, so I have no idea who they are. I don't know if they're British. I've never even heard of the label before. Something happened, and all of a sudden Amazon had like 7 or 8 copies, new copies available for less than $10. I want to say it was like $7 or $8 for a new sealed copy. I don't care if I'm not working. I couldn't jump on it fast enough. And I'm glad I got the album. And I think that's primarily my reason for doing this now. So if you're watching this a year later, it may or may not have any value. But I am going to try to put some links of Dave Bedford's music on anyway, so you can hear At very least, the Nurse's Song with Elephants is kind of weird. I'm going to warn you. I want to link that just so you can see the cover art that got me interested in him in the first place. But the Sun Paints Rainbows on the Vast Waves, I'm going to look for that piece. I saw it one time on YouTube. I'm going to try to link that. And that's from this album. And if you're going to look at his music at all, I highly recommend picking this up, especially now. I don't know how long those new sealed copies directly from Amazon, I don't know how long they're going to last. I don't know where they came from. This has been out of print, and this thing was ridiculously priced a year ago. So anybody that sees me that might be interested in this stuff, I wanted to make you guys aware, and while I was making you aware, I thought I would just do the video about my appreciation for him. And if you really don't like orchestral music, but if you like synthesizer music, I highly recommend the Great Equatorial, the voice print album. It's probably a hell of a lot easier to get if you live in Europe. But again, the copies here in America, sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not, and sometimes they're ridiculously priced. So that's my recommendations, my appreciation for somebody that I only, unfortunately, started buying albums by after he passed away. So look at the links if you guys are interested. I wanted to do something. I've been doing nothing for days except for, well, I've been writing a little music, but I haven't been getting too far with that. I hope everybody's having a great weekend. It's kind of coming to an end now. Whenever you see this, I hope everything's going well. And I'll be back soon with probably one of my more in-depth things. Take care, everybody.